chartered accountant by profession, and I was an auditor in the UK. I don't think I was a very good auditor, actually, because in retrospect, I like to be liked. One of the benefits of coming to Brussels is that you begin to see things through a different lens. You become aware of issues beyond the national boundaries of your home country. It just so happened that I came to Brussels at a time when the European Commission were beginning to realize that there was this huge profession called the accounting profession. There are hundreds of pages of standards which are extremely far-reaching and, quite frankly, were examples of the best example of bad legislation that I've come across in my career. I mean, it dates back to the financial crisis. Politicians were running around like headless chickens because you had banks that probably had assets in excess of the gross domestic product of a country. I became Irish in April 2007 because working closely to the European Parliament, I could see some of the British Conservative, at the time MEPs, who were members of EPP. And I have to say I was kind of worried by some of the ways in which some of these MEPs would talk about Europe that would really convince you that the European Union was just the worst thing possible.
I'd love to hear more about how you got into the CHS field, and it didn't start at first as a mental health support, as I understand. It was broader than that.
CHS has been around for over 50 years. There was the expectation that there would be a steady influx of people from Dublin and London coming to Brussels, having to deal with the Belgian bureaucracy. And so wouldn't it be a good idea if we had a little helpline that would provide support for people coming to Belgium? It's changed radically since then. I mean, we have a helpline, but today the calls that come to the helpline are 98% related to people with mental health issues. The calls that you get at 1 o'clock in the morning tend to be the hardest calls because on average now we're getting one suicidal call a day from someone expressing suicidal ideation. And those calls are particularly challenging for our volunteers. About 4 years ago, we entered into a partnership with Google, whereby if you do an internet search in Belgium suggesting that you might be considering suicide, you will get a thing that says, help is available, call the CHS.
Welcome to the next edition of Beyond the Bubble. As always, we would be more than grateful if you put a like and a subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube. And with that, it's great to have here someone with several decades of experience in the corporate world, but currently he's doing something which essentially we're going to focus on he's a volunteer and he's a bénévole, as they would say in Belgium. A Brit who spent 36 years in Brussels in Belgium with a long career at Ernst & Young, EY. But currently he's working as a volunteer and the president of an organization which has fascinated a lot of people. And I was very impressed when I heard about it, called Community Help Service, CHS. And we'll hear more about that, how that provides mental health support and other community support to those in need in English, for those who find themselves in this part of the world. So with that, a warm welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you, Andras.
Was that an accurate summary of what you do?
I think it was pretty accurate, yes.
Yes, and we also have to mention that at Ernst & Young EY, you held a very senior position. You were head of public policy and regulatory affairs for EMEA, so Europe, Middle East, and Africa.
And India and Russia and a few other countries that got swept into the EMEA category, if I could say that.
And how many years did you work with the EY?
I joined EY, originally I was with Arthur Andersen, and Arthur Andersen were a casualty of the Enron scandal at the turn of the millennium. And I joined EY in 2001. So I spent, 15 years with EY.
That's an interesting start for a conversation because we're going to transit to how you do the volunteer work and the mental health support and all that. But I think it's going to be interesting to contrast that with your corporate career. And having spent so much time and a full career in the corporate world, and not just the corporate world, but one of the largest companies in the world, but definitely the largest accounting or audit firms.
Yeah, certainly. EY is one of the big four accounting firms. I lose track of how many people they employ, but it's got to be, I don't know, 300,000. It's quite a lot.
That would make like a fully fledged city if you just do a full-on corporate summit and everybody being there. That's a
Absolutely,
city on its own.
Of course, it's spread out over hundreds of countries. Well, more than 100, that's for sure.
Right. And in that role, you coordinated, you were a manager, you were a senior leader. How do you think back of those times?
Well, I guess it dates back to when I first came to Brussels because I'm a chartered accountant by profession. And I qualified with Andersen in the UK, and I was an auditor in the UK. I don't think I was a very good auditor, actually, because in retrospect, I like to be liked. And I think an auditor has to be somebody who's prepared to enter into conflict with clients if there's something that's not good. So maybe I was not destined to be an auditor. But anyway, I was transferred to Brussels for a 2-year secondment in 1990, working with Andersen. And at the time, people were just beginning to realize that there was a thing called the European Union and that maybe it could have an impact on clients. And it just so happened that I came to Brussels at a time when the European Commission were beginning to realize that there was this huge profession called the accounting profession who were completely unregulated. Well, they were regulated, but they were self-regulated. And as the Commission put it, that was sort of chaps regulating chaps. It's a very English phrase, that a chap is a person.
Yeah.
People regulating people.
Yeah.
And so the Commission was thinking, well, we need to regulate these guys. And Andersen saw it coming and could see that there was a need to have somebody in Brussels beginning to develop the contacts and the relationships with people in the Commission and the Parliament as well, with a view to looking to safeguard the interests of the profession in the future.
Was it looked at in a way that you are there to monitor what's happening, the developments, and kind of report back? Or were you already tasked with trying to influence and trying to shape how that's going to turn out?
Well, initially it was more monitoring and reporting back, because back then there wasn't actually any legislation in the pipeline that would have impacted seriously the accounting profession. We had a piece of legislation since 1983, which was the 8th Company Law Directive at the time, and all that talked about was what it takes to become an accountant and the qualifications and the sort of syllabus that one has to study. But that was the only thing floating around. I think the first piece of legislation that I actually had a chance to sort of influence indirectly was the BCCI directive. And we managed to get, in collaboration with the European Accounting Federation, which back then was called FEE, today it's called Accountancy Europe, but we managed to get an article in the directive that said that if an auditor reported something in good faith, which he or she thought was inappropriate, and it subsequently turned out that it was not inappropriate, then we could not be sued. Because one of the biggest problems that the accounting profession faced and faces today is litigation. And so this was one way to try and limit litigation against the firms.
And how do you prove good faith?
That's a very good question. I think it comes back to looking at the facts of the case, looking at the working paper file, looking at the arguments that were used to support a certain position. But I mean, most accountants will say that they act entirely in good faith, but sometimes with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight, you can say, well, actually what you did was not appropriate.
Right. And so that was early 90s, around that time, which is interesting because if again, not necessarily zooming in on accounting per se, but you think about, it's not an emerging profession, but it was an unregulated profession, at least on European level, as you say, and it was self-regulated or nationally regulated. And it's interesting how the legislative avalanche kicked off at the time, because I imagine right now there are hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of regulations and standards and all the rest. So that all came into being around that time. And you can certainly find other sectors or industries right now which are in a similar situation today.
Indeed.
Would you agree with that?
Yes. I mean, there are hundreds of pages of standards, whether it be accounting standards or indeed auditing standards. But there are now two pieces of regulation and legislation at European level. There's a regulation and a directive, which are extremely far-reaching and, quite frankly, were examples of, the best example of bad legislation that I've come across in my career.
Why do you say so?
Because, it dates back to the financial crisis. And, of course, if you think back to the financial crisis...
The 2008,
the politicians were running around like headless chickens because you had banks that probably had assets in excess of the gross domestic product of a country. And if a bank goes down, it would take the country with it. So you can understand that the political classes were very anxious and nervous about the crisis, understandably so. And of course, then there was an awful lot of finger pointing, who was responsible. The banks obviously were in the frame, the private equity houses were in the frame, the credit rating agencies were in the frame, and eventually somebody said, well, surely the auditors should have seen this one coming, and we found ourselves in the crosshairs of future legislation. And the response and the legislative response was, in my opinion, not very good.
And if you look back at those times, do you think that the auditors were indeed at fault for not having spotted certain subprime loans and all the things that led to the crisis?
It's one of these sort of questions, but with the benefit of 20 hindsight, you might have said that the auditors should have seen it coming too, but the banking regulators didn't see it coming.
Right.
And in fact, the Commission's argument at the time was that there was something like 400 banks that received unqualified audit reports from the auditors, and yet within 12 months or so, those same banks were going to the government saying we need cash. And the Commission's argument was, well, surely if you'd been doing your audit properly, you would have qualified those accounts on the basis that the bank wasn't a going concern. Now, what's ironic is that if the audit profession had done that, the financial crisis would have been far more severe, because the minute you say that Barclays Bank is not a going concern, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and then you've really got a problem. What was going on behind the scenes was that the audit firms were having discussions with national government to say, look, we've got this bank. If we were to issue a qualified audit report, that would be a significant problem for you, Mr. Chancellor of the Exchequer. We need you to provide us with some assurance that if said bank requires liquidity, you will step in. And on that basis, you could give an unqualified audit opinion.
Do you think when there's a conflict between, like you say, a firm wanting to retain a client, it's well paid or there's high profit, versus what is the right thing to do, what is the legal thing to do, and also there's the litigation pressure, so there's a threat. So which one keeps the balance? Is it the external motivators? Is it your personal standing? How does that come together?
It's really, really challenging. I mean, we're all human beings, so we are subject to the foibles of being a human being. I think the answer in the case of many of these firms is actually to take the decision out of the country. Because first and foremost, the people in the country are the ones that are going to benefit from retaining a client and retaining the fees. Whereas somebody outside the country, albeit in a global position, is much better able to take a bigger view and say, look, this risk, quite frankly, we don't want it.
They're detached.
Exactly. And it might cost you at local level, but if it saves us 100 million at global level in terms of litigation costs, I think that's a good decision.
So is distance the answer?
I think maybe financial distance is the answer, yes, because it's very hard, as I said, for someone at local level who is evaluated and remunerated based upon his or her performance in terms of generating work. it's very hard for those people to be able to stand back and sometimes be as objective as they should be. Whereas if you're not in the country and you're not affected directly by those decisions, it's much easier to see what is the right thing to do.
Right. And I think that's perhaps a good segue to start talking about CHS and also the mental health, because when we talk about that detachment and distance, and first you will explain how the whole model of CHS is, but again, in mental health support, it's a fundamental point where for you to be able to help others, for you to be able to guide others or provide counsel, you need to be away, right? You need a certain distance, because if you're part of the situation or the emotional upheaval, you will not be able to do that. But again, that's more the segue. But before we get into that part, I'd love to hear more about how you got into the CHS field. And it didn't start at first as a mental health support, as I understand. It was broader than that. But let's hear.
Well, how did I get involved? I was at the time chairing a group of accountants in Belgium. These were Scottish, English, Welsh, Irish accountants resident in Belgium. And one of my members was at the time the then president of CHS and invited me to join the board. That was a board at the time. It's now a conseil d'administration.
So CHS, Community Help Service.
Community Help Service. So I got onto the council, let's call it the council of CHS. And he retired and I found myself taking over as president. It wasn't something that I actively went out to do. But
you seem to have that pattern that you enter an organization and you find yourself being president.
Well, I'm thrilled that I am. I mean, it's an honor, really, an honor to be president of CHS. I mean, it's a real opportunity for me as a volunteer to be able to give back, because I have had a long, I wouldn't say illustrious, but I've had a long career in the accounting profession. It's done me well, and it seems to me only fit and proper that I should be using my skills to give back to the community. CHS has been around for over 50 years. It was created back in 1971. It was an initiative sort of driven by the pastoral community, so the churches in Belgium, with support from the British Embassy and also from the Irish Embassy in the background. And the idea at that time, of course, neither Ireland nor the United Kingdom were members of the European Union, but were expecting to be members in a couple of years' time. So there was the expectation that there would be a steady influx of people from Dublin and London coming to Brussels, having to deal with the Belgian bureaucracy. And so wouldn't it be a good idea if we had a little helpline that would provide support for people coming to Belgium in terms of, how do I get Belgacom, which was then the telecoms provider in Belgium, how do I get Belgacom to install a fixed line telephone in my house before I have to leave in 5 years' time? I mean, seriously, those sorts of issues. How do I find an English-speaking plumber? Those sorts of things. It's changed radically since then. I mean, we have a helpline, but today the calls that come to the helpline are 98% related to people with mental health issues. Because, of course, with the advent of the internet, you don't really need something like the CHS to find an English-speaking plumber. You can go online and Google it. So the helpline today takes roughly 5,000 calls a year from people. It's an English-speaking, confidential, anonymous, and free service. So we don't charge beyond the cost of someone phoning the line. And in parallel to that, we have a group of 20 psychologists, psychiatrists, psychotherapists, that's our mental health services centre, who provide real mental health services to real people face to face, whereas, of course, the helpline is anonymous, and so people call the line and talk to one of our volunteers, and they do a fantastic job.
Oh, that's fascinating. So 5,000 calls, which means 10, 15, 20 calls a day on average, which is quite substantial.
Yeah, the calls fluctuate. We know from our experience that you get fewer calls at night, 1 o'clock in the morning, than you do at 9 o'clock in the evening. That said, the calls that you get at 1 o'clock in the morning tend to be the hardest calls, because on average now we're getting one suicidal call a day from someone expressing suicidal ideation. And those calls are particularly challenging for our volunteers. So we focus an awful lot on supervision and training. We currently have 2 psychologists who are paid by CHS to look after the mental health of our volunteers on the helpline, as well as the training of those volunteers and the way in which the line operates. And in fact, we're looking to recruit a 3rd supervisor because of the nature of the calls. The model we have today is the model we had 25 years ago with 2 supervisors, but the calls today are radically different to the calls that we took 25 years ago.
I can imagine. Have you yourself ever serviced calls?
I would be a complete disaster on taking calls because I'm a public school boy. If somebody phoned up the helpline and spoke to Jeremy Jennings, I would probably tell them to take a cold shower and get over it. So no is the simple answer to that question.
I see.
No, seriously, it takes a very special set of skills. I mean, our volunteers, some of them have a background in mental health. One I can think of has a master's in psychology from Columbia University. So these are people that are very, very talented and have got the experience. And then we provide them with the training as well. So as I said, they do a really fantastic job, and they're all volunteers, so no one gets paid.
Yeah. And what does the training include?
Well, we entered into an agreement with an organization called Befrienders Worldwide about 5 years ago. It's an umbrella organization covering about 350 or so mental health type organizations like CHS. And one of their member bodies is the UK Samaritans. The Samaritans are significantly larger than we are. I mean, we have roughly 32 volunteers on the helpline. The Samaritans have 22,000. So as a result of our membership of Befrienders Worldwide, we now use the Samaritans training materials. So all our new volunteers go through the Samaritans training, plus they will have a mentor from amongst our own numbers. So our mentors are those with significant experience in the mental health space to ensure that they have the best possible training to then take the line.
And so the volunteer doesn't need to be a therapist or with a psychological education, but they need to certainly have the ability, the certain baseline competencies to be able to do that, or to be allowed to do this.
I'd say, this is a generalization, probably half our volunteers do have a background in mental health. I'm sure I'll probably get shot for saying that, but 50% give or take. But the other 50% who don't, you can provide them with the training they need. And ultimately, I mean, they need to be able to speak English because it's an English-speaking service. They need to be able to listen. They need to be empathetic to a certain degree. We're not there to necessarily provide solutions because oftentimes the people you're talking to, you can't just give them a solution over the phone. The fact that you're there listening to them and empathizing in itself is 90% of the battle.
I would tend to assume that, where somebody calling is not necessarily looking for a solution, just looking for a sympathetic ear and someone to empathize with them and listen to what they have to say and kind of walk them through, or at least just to have a conversation, a connection, ultimately. Is that how you see that?
Yeah, exactly right. Essentially, it's a listening service. I mean, we are not therapists. We are not entering into a sort of a therapist relationship with a client because this is all anonymous and independent and whatever. So someone can call the line today and you may never hear from them again. Whereas on the mental health services side, clearly these are real-life psychiatrists talking to and meeting with real-life people, which is very, very different to the model of the helpline.
And do you talk to the volunteers to get a sense of, do you classify what sort of calls people need help with, or I mean, what sort of issues, what sort of calls come in?
Yeah, we moved away from Proximus to a company called Destiny about 4 years ago. With Proximus, we used to get a monthly invoice, and that was it. With Destiny, we get a huge volume of statistical data that does enable us to get a better handle on what is coming into the helpline. What I found amazing was that actually 15% of the calls that we get come from people with phone numbers that are not a Belgian phone number. Now, you could say, well, that's because they're a French or a German person using their mobile phone in Belgium. But actually, we know that we get phone calls from people in America. Took a call yesterday from somebody in Honolulu. And of course, an English-speaking service with the joys of the internet, you can do a Google search, you find CHS, you pick up the phone and you call. So it's not just a service for people living in Belgium. It's actually a service that is being used globally, but we're still small when you compare us to the Samaritans.
Yeah, but in terms of the content, so in terms of topics that seem to be recurring, so you mentioned that suicidal call would happen roughly once a day. Would the volunteers say most people seem to be having this particular issue or that particular topic that's on their mind?
Yeah, the dilemma we face, of course, is that this is an anonymous service, so there's a limit to how much analysis of calls you want to do. I mean, the volunteers, we call them PATs. Why do we call them PATs? Because if somebody calls the line and says, "What's your name?" the answer is, "My name is Pat," which could be Patrick, it could be Patricia, it could be whatever. The Samaritans, they are all called Joe, which could be John, it could be Joanna, it could be anything. So our volunteers are anonymous. They do, however, discuss calls sort of generically at regular meetings of all the volunteers with the helpline supervisors, because you've taken a difficult call and you reflect on that call having ended the call, and you question whether you could have managed it better. So having a forum in which you can discuss that call and the way you dealt with it, and not be critiqued necessarily, but to hear advice from others, can be quite beneficial. We also have a number of people for whom the helpline is actually more of a lifeline, and they phone on a regular basis. So there the challenge is recognizing that these people have mental health issues, but if they're calling the helpline 3 or 4 times a day, they are blocking the service for other people that might have more critical issues. And those people, again, they get discussed, and people are all familiar with the issues that these individuals have, so that rather than each call being a call that starts from a zero base, the volunteers actually know that this individual has phoned before, and you have an idea as to sorts of issues that this individual is going to talk about, and so you have a better understanding and a better ability to empathize and respond to that particular caller.
Are there recurring themes or recurring patterns?
Yeah, I think the majority of calls, as an accountant, I like statistics, okay? But I don't think I should use hard numbers because it's such a vague thing. But burnout, depression, loneliness, anxiety, I think those would feature in the top 10, big time. So most of our calls have that in some way, shape or form. Burnout in the last 5 years has become, at a Belgian level, a real issue. I mean, the numbers are increasing quite alarmingly. If you look at the number of people reported over the last 5 years, I think the instances of burnout have gone up by like 50% in 5 years, and particularly for the under 30 group, where it went up by something like 20% in 1 year. I mean, this is not based on CHS numbers, it's based on the Belgian sort of government numbers, if I can say that. So burnout and depression are big. The impact of COVID, I think, has been one of the contributory factors to that. I also think the geopolitical environment we find ourselves in today, with what going on in America and Ukraine and Israel, all of those issues are affecting on people's mental health and are contributing to a feeling of anxiety and everything that goes with it.
And how much can a person do in a call? So how much can a volunteer achieve in a call? Is there even some stated goal for the volunteers to aim towards in a call, or is it perhaps calm the person down, or maybe direct them for further help, or just simply be there and hope for the best?
It's. I mean, not being a helpline volunteer myself, it's a little bit hard for me to give you, a good response to that. But I can tell you that having spoken to many of our PATs, there are times when they say, I really made a difference. And you know that you really made a difference because the person you're talking to expresses relief at the end of the call and says, thank you so much. This was absolutely amazing. I am convinced that our volunteers have saved lives. But of course, being an anonymous service, you can't really provide any factual basis for that.
Must be very frustrating, no?
Well, it is, because of course people look at the CHS and they'll go on Google and look at the reviews. And of course, people who phone the helpline and who get that sort of relief from a call don't want to publicize the fact that they called the helpline and it was a good experience. So we tend not to get people expressing positive reviews because they don't do it. But I know for a fact that, our PATs have taken calls and have made a genuine difference. There are times, though, when you can't make a difference, because we took a call the other day. It was a lady who wanted to have her 2.5-year-old daughter tested at Saint-Luc.
The hospital.
The hospital. And the waiting time was 1 year. Now, what can you do as a helpline volunteer to reduce the waiting time at Saint-Luc? Nothing. So all you can do is sort of sympathize and empathize and say, well, have you perhaps tried another hospital? Have you perhaps tried this and that and the other? But at the end of the day, you don't really have the solutions necessarily for that sort of problem. It's beyond your control.
And that reminds me how important boundaries are. And perhaps the fact that it's anonymous, it does help keep those boundaries, because if there was further connection or you actually knew who's on the other side of the line, I might go the extra mile, which in some cases is not necessarily a good thing. You need to keep a certain limit as to how far are you willing or are you able to help, and not necessarily to do certain things, or look up another hospital, or maybe the chief doctor in another hospital and you ask a personal favor because here's a person in need, which is not something that is ethical or the right thing, or even from a mental health support perspective, the right thing to do. So it's very, very delicate where that line is between the helpline person and the caller.
Yes, it does, change depending on the nature of the call. I mean, there are some times where you can make a suggestion which actually can make a difference. If you have someone who is being subjected to abuse from a spouse, then there are places that we can refer that individual to go to be safe. So there you can make a difference. But someone who's got a 1-year waiting time to see their daughter be tested, I mean, there's not much one can do apart from say, well, have you tried another hospital?
Yeah, and I'm sure that there are also cases when, similarly, where it's not a practical obstacle that the person needs to fix, like a waiting list or a waiting time, but it could be in an impossible family situation, or like you say, if it's abuse, you can direct them to certain resources, but that's how far it's possible, which might already be extremely helpful, just to raise awareness that there is such a thing. There are certain resources that they can turn to.
Absolutely. And if someone calls the line and they are truly suicidal, then you can tell them to go to the A&E department of the hospital, and they can be medicated and taken care of. And so that's practical advice, and it happens. But the calls are all different, and so it does require the volunteers to be able to be fluid and able to adapt to the nature of the call. But listening, as you said earlier on, is actually half the battle. That somebody is talking to someone who's not judging them and who is able to provide support and just encourage them to think about other things that they might be able to do. And, I know from a fact that there are calls that end really, really well. where the individual says, my gosh, thank you, you've really made a difference.
Is there anyone else listening in on a call for, I'm not saying quality assurance purposes like they would do in call centers, but perhaps just to help the counselor guide the conversation better, or it's strictly between the two of them?
It's totally anonymous. There is nobody listening. We have the facility, if we wanted to do that, but we don't. I think, there are companies that will have their own internal helplines, but they are not particularly well regarded by the workforce, because there is always this concern that somebody somewhere might either be listening in, or the call is then somehow shared with the human resource department, and it could impact negatively on that person's career progression. So we get a lot of calls from people from the large corporates who feel safer talking to CHS than they would do talking to a company funded helpline. We also get a lot of Belgians actually calling the helpline, and that's not because they want to practice their English. I think, again, it's because the perception that the French and Flemish and German-speaking helplines, which are government-funded, may not be completely independent. I'm sure they are, but the perception is there that maybe somehow someone's listening. And they prefer to speak to CHS because it truly is independent and totally anonymous.
That makes me think of the power of anonymity, because that's essentially what you're saying, where people fully trust that the conversation is not recorded, it's not being listened to, it's really anonymous. And I think a phone call, perhaps even to like a landline, which practically may not be a landline, but the perception, or at least the trust, needs to be there, which is different from even sending an email or talking to an AI chatbot or any other innovative way. It's the good old traditional human conversation through a phone that I can trust.
Exactly right. Vast majority of the calls that we get, probably 75%, are from mobile phones, not from landlines, but I think that's just a function of the fact that everyone has mobile phones and we don't have landlines any longer. But I think being able to talk to somebody and knowing that nobody else is listening, nobody else is privileged to this conversation, provides the caller with the assurance and the safety that they can actually really say what they want to say without being judged.
It's a little bit like confession, no? At least the nature of it, the way it's conceived is that you don't need to reveal yourself, but you can speak your mind. And again, I don't want to get into the religious aspects and the whole power dynamics around it, but at least as an institution, if I can call it an institution, is I can totally speak my mind. There's not going to be a trace of that. So there's not going to be judgment. There's not going to be a backlash, reputational, personal, or other. And therefore, I can truly reveal what's on my mind.
That is true. I mean, we have seen an increasing number of calls from youngsters, between the ages of 10 and 20. So teens and adolescents and young adults. And one of the issues that is out there, but which we haven't yet had a lot of calls, is addiction to pornography. And there are a lot of kids that access pornography and it can become an addiction. But to talk about that is something that, kids wouldn't want to do. So you wouldn't want to share with your friends that you're doing it. You certainly wouldn't want to share with your teachers at school. And we've had a couple of calls from young men who have recognized that they have an addiction and have had the strength to call the helpline and actually discuss it with one of our PATs. I think that is out there as a big issue because, of course, everyone has mobile phones. It's very easy to download stuff and,
And it's interesting, the age group also. So it's really across the line, I guess. I'm wondering also if, so there is the kind of the teen cohort. Would you have more middle age, or would you have more men and women, or seniors? Do you even track that in any way, or because of the anonymity, you'd rather not?
Well, we do track. You can tell if someone's a man or a woman, by and large. I mean, you have a third box for sort of gender fluid in the middle. But the numbers, quite frankly, 1 month you might get more calls from men, and the next month you get more calls from women. So I don't think you can generalize on that. We try and track age, but of course it's anonymous, so we don't know how old the person is. However, if they're talking about their experiences today at school, you know that they're probably somewhere between X and Y. If they're talking about, loneliness and their partner of 40 years has died, then you can probably say that they're somewhere in their 60s or 70s. But it doesn't really mean a lot. All I can say is that we get an increasing number of calls from younger people than we do from older people.
And you don't go beyond the phone service, as I understand. So you do recommend them resources, or you try to provide them or connect them with others, but you as an organization, you would not speak up on mental health issues, or you would not necessarily take positions on these, what could be done on a policy on a policy level to mitigate these. Is that right?
That is right, but the reason for that is one of bandwidth and resource. I mean, the helpline costs us about 40,000 euros a year to run, and we are dependent 100% on voluntary contributions from people. So we are constantly looking to raise money to cover the costs. That does not provide us with the flexibility or the ability to go out there and start doing public policy stuff, because we just haven't got the time and the money to do it. We are actually incredibly lucky because we were able to sign a sort of partnership deal with Pieta in Ireland. Pieta organise an annual walk called Darkness into Light, which is to raise awareness about suicide and try and prevent suicide. And for 2025, we, the CHS, were the beneficiary of the Belgian walk. And the team that organised this event in Brussels are absolutely amazing, led by a delightful lady in the European Commission called Sarah Ironside, but she's got this amazing team around her. And this year we reckon they've raised for us over 40,000 euros. So this one event has actually covered the annual cost of the helpline. That is enabling us, firstly, to recruit, as I said, a third supervisor, because we need to have more support for our own volunteers. It may also enable us to have a toll-free number, because, quite frankly, the phone number that you have to dial to get to the CHS is an 02 number, and I can't remember it. Whereas if it was something like, 101, or well, not 101, but, an easy number to remember, and it was toll-free, then we could truly say that this is a genuinely free service, completely free. But that'll cost money, so we're currently going through the process to identify what that might cost and can we afford it.
And is this a unique initiative in other country, or in Belgium, but does it exist in other countries? Or you mentioned the Samaritans. So is this because there's a large number of English-speaking people in Belgium, or is there such a thing in Germany or in Poland or in other parts of the world?
The Darkness into Light event was created in Ireland by Pieta back in 2009, I think it was. But now, today, they do walks on the same day. So this year it was on the 10th of May, 5 o'clock in the morning, and you walk as the sun rises. We gathered around the Parc Saint-Contenaire, which is a lovely place to be. But there were walks in many other countries around the world, and it raises a significant amount of money, not only for the local beneficiary charities, but also for Pieta in Ireland. So everyone who registers to walk here in Belgium, half the registration cost goes to Pieta in Ireland, but all the donations and stuff come directly to the beneficiary here in Belgium. But it's a tremendous event, well worth doing.
And do you think that the kind of calls and the conversations, is that representative of larger trends in society? So are you seeing in a drop, are you seeing the ocean, or you wouldn't necessarily extrapolate that?
It's a little bit hard. I mean, because, as I said, we do get calls from outside Belgium, you can't say that the 5,000 plus calls to the helpline is a uniquely Belgian phenomenon. If you look at the suicide statistics in Belgium, they have been consistently above the EU average. They are coming down in Belgium closer to the EU average, although that could be because the EU average is actually coming up. But we are seeing an increase in the number of suicide calls to our helpline. But that can be affected by at least two factors. The first being that not everyone who calls us is in Belgium. Secondly, about 4 years ago, we entered into a partnership with Google, whereby if you do an internet search in Belgium suggesting that you might be considering suicide, and it can be in French or English, you will get a thing that says, help is available, call the CHS. So inevitably, that has increased the number of calls coming to us. What I find interesting is that when I took over as president, there was, and this was before we entered into this relationship with Google, there is another organization out there called suicidal.org, and they had identified us as a suicide helpline. And some of our helpline volunteers who've been around on the helpline for many years were feeling anxious that that wasn't what the helpline should be doing. I think the problem actually was that we hadn't provided the training around suicide and awareness of suicide, which we now do routinely. And my personal view is that actually we are now providing a much better service in dealing with these suicide calls than we are dealing with people looking for an English-speaking plumber. But it does come at a cost to our volunteers, which is why we place such a huge emphasis on support for them and their own mental health, because you take a 2-hour call from someone who is suicidal, you probably need a week to get over it.
That's something I wanted to come back to, and good that you raise it. So how do you prevent or help the volunteers from burnout on their own side? Because listening to these extremely difficult conversations must be very taxing.
It is. Recruiting another supervisor, one of the things that this supervisor will do is to, on a regular basis, reach out to the volunteers, particularly those that have recorded difficult calls. So, okay, we have our statistics that we get from Destiny, but they're purely sort of numbers. We then try and capture in a little spreadsheet the types of calls and, recording a little bit of detail about the calls themselves. And if somebody has said, I took a particularly difficult call last night from someone who was blah, 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 that's where the supervisor can read the logs and see that someone has just taken a really hard call, pick up the phone and say, how do you feel? Do you want to talk? Were there things that you could have said better? Is there training that we can provide? All that sort of stuff. So we do prioritize the mental health of our volunteers because, they are one of our most important assets.
Yeah. And volunteers, can they do this for a long time? So are they able to continue for months or years?
They can. We have one volunteer who's been on the line for nearly 30 years, which is an incredible, incredible thing. Of course, Brussels being Brussels, many people come to Belgium either as a travelling spouse or whatever, and they find an opportunity to give back, and then spouse moves back to America and they go. So every year we'll probably lose 4 or 5 volunteers simply because they've left the country and gone elsewhere. So we're constantly looking for volunteers to do the job. We have 32 at the moment, although 3 of those have just come to the end of their training, so may not yet have started to take the line, although I know that they have a CHS phone and they have a SIM card because I have to arrange for that with Destiny.
No, it did cross my mind. I mentioned to you offline, it crossed my mind at some point to volunteer, but then I realized I wasn't yet ready for it, but hopefully someday soon I can dedicate a bit of time to this because I'm really interested and I hope I could be helpful.
Well, one of the things that we've done recently is to actually reduce the number of hours that our volunteers have to do on the line in a 2-week period. So they now have to do just one shift a week. A shift is 3 hours, so they're doing 6 hours in a 2-week period. It used to be 7.5 hours, which was a funny number. And that's in recognition that these calls are difficult. The other thing is, of course, that you can actually do this from home. You don't need to go to an office somewhere and sit in front of a computer screen and do it, unlike the Samaritans. And the joys of modern technology are that you can actually take calls from anywhere in the world. If you're on holiday in, I don't know, Tenerife, you can take your CHS phone and be on the line taking calls in Tenerife, and the person calling the line knows that someone's there listening but doesn't know where that person is.
And do you have any statistics or numbers how long the calls last, or it largely depends on the other variables and the substance of it?
We do. We know that roughly 1,100 hours were spent talking in 2024. It's gone up this year. But one thing we do notice is that the calls that we take are getting longer and harder. So I think that just demonstrates that more and more people are phoning not with issues about finding an English-speaking plumber, but issues that really have substance and meat behind them, which require a lengthier conversation. So yes, calls getting longer and harder, and the number of calls is going up as well. So it's a double whammy.
So you mentioned even a 1 hour, 2 hour long call is not unheard of.
It's not. We try and close a call down after 45 minutes because oftentimes you get to a certain period in the call where actually you're not going to make any more progress. You've done the listening and the person is just repeating what they said 25 minutes ago. But of course, you have to be a little bit sympathetic and empathetic. You can't just say, well, that's enough, you cut them off. So you have to find a way to sort of close the call. And that's part of the training as well. How do you end a call? Because, you're blocking the line for somebody else.
But you also mentioned at some point where the therapists or psychologists are also in short supply.
Yes, I mean, one of the first questions that you would make when talking to someone on the helpline is, are you already seeing a therapist? But unfortunately, we know from our own experiences at CHS that, for every 10 people that phone the offices of CHS, which, by the way, are also staffed by volunteers who do a fantastic job, but for every 10 people that apply to us for a consultation, we can probably only see 5, and we have to refer the other 5 out to other practitioners. So, the waiting lists that you see at St. Luke are kind of no different to the sorts of waiting lists that you see amongst the psychiatrist and psychologist community as well.
So if you had a magic wand to say make the service, the system, the scale far better, what would you use it for?
I think there needs to be better access to mental health care in general. I mean, we've made progress in the last few years because now if you go and see a psychologist as opposed to a psychiatrist, psychiatrists are doctors, by the way, if you go and see a psychologist, the cost of that is now covered by the mutuelle. So that's great.
The health insurance.
Yeah. The problem is that there really aren't enough mental health caregivers. I saw a number that said that there are currently 2,010 mental health practitioners in Belgium, but that number is expected to rise over the next 5 years by 20. Now that's 1% increase over 5 years. That's not enough. We just need more people providing the service. I mean, we've been trying to recruit a very talented South African psychologist to CHS, and after 18 months, we still haven't got clearance from the local professional body, and the individual's, quite frankly, giving up the will to live and will probably stay in South Africa. That's a great shame. So I think there needs to be more done to encourage people to move and join local professions to provide services to locals in the country.
I completely agree. That is essential and it's life-saving in so many instances. And as a closing question, I'm wondering, and I can't help but ask you, so how does your career in Ernst & Young and EY, being a chartered accountant and leading regulatory affairs, blend into mental health support. So do you see any commonality? Do you see any red thread between these two?
I think what I've been able to do is draw upon my skills as a chartered accountant and apply them in terms of the way in which CHS as an organisation is structured and operates. When I joined the then board of the CHS, it struck me as crazy that the board would review and approve the accounts and review and approve the budget. We would then have an annual general meeting, and the only people that were eligible to vote at the AGM were members of the board. And I said, well, that's madness. So, in fact, one of the things I did was to change our statutes quite radically so that now every member of the CHS family is entitled to vote at the AGM. I also,
general meeting.
At the annual general meeting, I also increased the representation on council of both members from the helpline and members from the clinical team. Because again, when I joined, there was one helpline rep and there was one clinical team rep, and that was it. So now we have 4 volunteers on the council from helpline and roughly the same number from the clinical team. But it helps to break down silos. My concern at CHS when I joined was that the helpline was almost a semi-autonomous entity doing its own thing, and the clinical team was exactly the same, and then you had a board of directors that, quite frankly, was almost redundant. Now the council of CHS is a vibrant animal, and I think that the way it operates today is much better compared to where it was, and I think, in part, that's because I was able to bring my non-mental health related skills to the table and make some changes.
And I think that speaks to the power of governance and the power of structures and systems and workflows and all the rest, so that the substantive work of helping those in need can be better serviced.
Absolutely right. I'm a very keen supporter of governance and transparency.
With those words, let's take the cards. This is the time to pick one.
Do I get to choose?
Yes, you get to choose.
Okay.
And just please read it out and let's see what challenge you are given.
At what age do you feel someone stops being attractive to you?
Oh.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, quite frankly, age, in my opinion, is totally irrelevant, because what is attractive is the intellect of the individual that you're with. And I find that my dear wife, not only is she remarkably attractive, but she's also the sharpest knife in the drawer. And I find it incredibly rich and enriching to be able to have discussions with someone who's intellectually superior to myself. So that would be my response.
So that it radiates to the outside world.
Absolutely.
With those words. Thank you very much. Thanks for sharing all of that.
Andras, thank you.